Well, yeah, I'm not big on drugs, but yeah. Well, if you have
Okay, I think everybody is here. Everybody's ready. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mylène Simard. I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Ininiwak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here today to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of Water Confidential, witnessing Justice Denied, the Fight for Safe Drinking Water by Susan Blacklin. The book is the story of Blacklin's decades-long dedication, along her then husband, Dr. Hans Peterson, to secure safe drinking water for First Nation and rural communities in Canada. We're grateful to Caitlin Press for publishing this volume and for arranging this celebratory evening. Following a reading from the author and a conversation around the book, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. I'll be back at the close of the event to review signing procedures. There will be a signing. Until then, I'd like to introduce the host of tonight's evening. It's Zilla Jones. She's an African-American woman writing in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. In 2023, she was a Journey Prize winner and a finalist in the Writers' Trust Bronwyn Wallace Award. In 2024, she was shortlisted in the CBC Short Fiction Contest and is currently a finalist for a National Magazine Award in Fiction. She has also won the Malahat Review Open Season Award, the Jacob Zilber Short Fiction Prize, the Free Fall Short Fiction Prize Award, and the Gritlit Short Story Award, placed second in the Prairie Fire Short Fiction Prize and the Austin Clark Prize, and won the honorable mention in the Room Magazine Short Story Prize. That's a lot. I should have practiced. That's a lot of accolades. Her short stories appear in Prairie Fire, the Malahat Review, Prism International, The Fiddlehead, Freefall Magazine, The Ex-Puritan, Room Magazine, Bayou Magazine, The Journey Prize Stories, and anthologies of Nottingham Writers Studio and the Federation of BC Writers. Her debut novel, The World So Wide, and a short fiction collection, So Much to Tell, and a short fiction are forthcoming with Comrade Books in 2025 and 2026. Zilla is interested in themes of social justice, and she writes about race, identity, migration, intergenerational trauma, policing, and the climate crisis. Welcome, Zilla.
It's great to see everybody out here to support Susan on a very miserable evening. So thank you all for coming. I have the great pleasure of introducing Susan Blacklin to you. I know some of you know her, but you might not know anything about her. So Susan Blacklin was born in the UK near London, and she moved to Canada as a young adult. She lived in Winnipeg, various rural areas of Saskatchewan, and in BC. She's worked in the fashion industry. She's worked for nonprofits. She's run an import business and a dog breeding business. She raised 4 children during this time and had several dogs as well. And Susan and her former husband, Dr. Hans Peterson, founded the Safe Drinking Water Foundation, and they spent 15 years educating and advocating on drinking water issues with a focus on bringing safe water to several First Nations as well as to rural communities. She's now retired and lives in Vancouver Island, where she writes, paints, and gardens. Water Confidential is Susan's first book. And I have to say, I met Susan for the first time this morning, and this bio does not do her justice. Susan is an incredible woman. That's apparent from even a short meeting with her. She's highly committed to social justice causes and in leaving this planet a better place. And it's very inspiring to me that in her book, Susan talks about leaving school at 15 years of age, but she's accomplished so much in her life, and she's proof that writing really is for everyone. So please welcome Susan. She's going to read to us from part of her book, and she will explain more about that. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much for coming, everybody. It's really nice to see some very old, very dear friends, especially along here. To see the first friend I made in Canada when I first arrived here, the first person I saw the first day that I came here to Winnipeg, and my sister-in-law, my nephews, some other friends. Thank you very much to all of you for coming. I'm going to start by reading 2 short stories out of my book, which kind of gives you, I hope gives you a good idea of what most of the book is about. One day, Hans and I were driving along the Highway number 1 West. We planned to hang a right and take Highway 2 North towards home. I was driving, as I always did whenever Hans and I traveled together. Hans was always needing to review a scientific paper, provide comments to a PhD student, or simply read one of his heavy, hard-covered science books. The black leather bag phone, as we called it, was sitting below the gear shift. It was too large to sit in the gap between our 2 bucket seats. It was one of the first cell phones, fixed in place in the bag, which was the size of a shoebox. When we unzipped the lid, we could pull out an extending antenna. By lifting the bag and holding it on the dashboard, if we were lucky enough to be in a hotspot, we could pick up or make phone calls, holding the receiver to our ears, much like the old telephones of days gone by. Hans was talking on the phone, and as he hung up, he declared, "Perfect timing. We're not going straight home. Head to Jim's. He wants to show me some farmers nearby who have problems with their water." And so we continued west on Highway number 1 to Rush Lake. It was already late in the day and I was tired. It was early springtime, and while the city streets and sidewalks were almost clear of snow, rural gravel roads still had their 3 distinct tracks. If I met anyone coming towards us, one of us had to jump tracks and make a new trail. As we approached Jim's farmyard, I noted that we still had They still had the remains of their snow pile where the children had tobogganed most of the winter. Although the dirty grey mounds were still evident, the melting snow was adding to the runoff, leaving large puddles of water everywhere around the yard, often with twigs or hay floating in them. Farm dogs had begun shedding their winter coats, and they looked as dirty as the water pooled around them. The dogs greeted us noisily. The farmhouse door opened before we could get out of the car. "We put the coffee on, thanks so much for coming by." I knew the rules. Don't ever accept a coffee or anything made with water from any of these farms. It wasn't hard for me as I had stopped drinking coffee decades ago. Rice Krispie cakes were on a plate to welcome us, and I felt the middle-aged couple were ready to give us their firstborn in appreciation for us stopping by. They were so grateful. As always, Hans took samples of their water, a sample from each tap in the house. You could have heated a cup of their water and anyone would have thought it was tea. Each sample looked just like the puddles of water outside. Each farm we visited that night made us feel welcomed. Although we were strangers when we arrived, I felt like we were saying goodbye to old friends when we left. Each of the farmers had disgusting brown water, and one young family complained they couldn't bathe their children in it. So once a week, they drove to Swift Current to take them to a swimming pool to get showered. I felt ill at the thought of those poor people needing to boil and then drink this awful water. More than one family lifted their t-shirts to show us the open sores on their bodies. The stories were always similar. They were on wells and septic fields and had no one but themselves to solve the problems, and no money to invest into any fancy purification systems. Reverse osmosis wasn't the answer, as the number of dissolved organics, or floaties, in the water was so high it would have clogged any reverse osmosis membrane within minutes. One of the farms we visited that night etched a place in my heart that will never heal. The farmer claimed his drinking water could light a match. Impossible, I thought to myself. I would still say it was impossible today if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. They kept a box of matches on the counter, ready to light the propane stove. I looked at the old stainless steel sink, then it reminded me of the fuel stains left on asphalt after a leaky vehicle had parked there. The farmer ran the tap and we watched a murky brownish water pour into the stained sink. Then he reached for the round dark brown switch on the old farmhouse kitchen wall and flicked off the light. We stood in darkness, waiting. He took a single match from the box and held it close to the water, probably the width of one finger away from the cascading water and halfway between the tap and the sink. Suddenly, the match caught light. There was sufficient gas streaming from the tap to ignite the match without striking. A ball of fire erupted and continued burning until he dropped the red-hot remnants of the match into the sink. I was in shock. Hans was not. He had seen this many times before on reserves. This was the first time he saw it in a white person's rural home. The farmer flicked the kitchen light back on, and I think he saw my look of utter amazement. The drinking water was likely contaminated with methane, which has a high solubility in water. The farmer had tried to get help from a provincial authority with no success. They had claimed he must have his manure pile too close to his wellhead. That methane gas must be the culprit, that it must be leached into his well. He was adamant this was not the case. This was typical of the problems in rural areas. It seemed to me to be a never-ending circle. Just as I listened to all the horror stories from First Nations about their terrible medical conditions resulting from their contaminated water, so too did I listen to repeated stories of farmers trying to alert or request support from government agencies. When they explained their contaminated drinking water concerns, the government departments responsible pulled excuse number 19, or perhaps number 13, from a hat and blamed it on the farmer, or justified it as being naturally occurring. I never once heard of any government agency giving a reasonable response. I never heard of anyone willing to support individual farmers and their water problems. I have a feeling this was one of so many that Hans was not able to help. There is controversy as to whether major increases in methane is a naturally occurring phenomenon, or if it could be the result of fracking. However, research indicates we can no longer blame the cows for this amount of methane entering the atmosphere as the main contributor to greenhouse gases. Fracking has been identified as taking first place. We know the increase is largely due to fossil fuel production, and this research suggests over half is from shale gas operations, says Robert Howarth, an ecologist at Cornell University. I would like to see an inquiry treated as a research project whereby a map showing the fracking seams beneath the earth has an overlay showing all the places where methane is detectable in the drinking water. Hans and I arrived home exhausted in the early hours of the morning. I chose this story to tell you because it's not just First Nations who have really deplorable drinking water. So now I'm going to tell you a little story about some First Nations communities. When possible, I drove to meet with leaders to determine if and how we could help them. One time when I visited Hans at Saddle Lake, I made a trip to meet with many First Nations community leaders in north central Alberta, including those at Slave Lake, Frog Lake, Deneta, Beaver, and Driftpile First Nations. When I visited with leaders, we often sat with cups of blueberry tea warming our hands. And I should mention here that I always met with the women leaders, the elders, and sometimes the women were chiefs. I knew only too well the risks I was taking, but I trusted they had boiled their water, and I could never have refused their generous hospitality. We would spend hours chatting like dear friends. Some of the communities had recently received indoor plumbing, no doubt funded by INAC. INAC is Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. And the women wondered if perhaps the plumbing was sent almost as a bribe. See? We're giving you things, be thankful, stop complaining and asking for more. The women held painful feelings deep inside their souls. They felt like second-class citizens. Their heartache was evident in every word they uttered, and I felt their pain in every syllable. I believed every word. Once I understood and witnessed the challenges, I shared their pain, their frustrations. I was angry at those in places of power for their inaction. I felt that white people had betrayed Indigenous peoples, that they had taken advantage of them and benefited from their adversity. I was walking in their moccasins for a short while, but I had the option to step back into my own shoes and act as if nothing was wrong. I knew I couldn't live with myself if I joined the white attitude of denial. Now I knew, and the more I knew, the more compelled I was to act, to do my best to right each wrong. The leaders at Driftpile Cree Nation believed that the Swan Hills Treatment Center was the cause of their concerns. They called the plant the Swan Hills Toxic Waste Dump. At the first mention of Swan Hills, I conjured up memories in my mind of an idyllic British pond at Thaden Boys, a village near where I lived as a young girl. The image of the pond I had in mind was in springtime, and swans were swimming gracefully around, their cygnets following in their wake. I knew from experience that swans could become aggressive and protective. After listening to the concerns of the leaders, I drove to the Swan Hills Treatment Center to check things out. The town of Swan Hills is at an elevation of 1,113 meters, but Driftpile Cree Nation is at an elevation of 577 meters. The winding gravel road, which more resembled a logging road, took me up a small mountain. Tall evergreens stood like knights in each side of me. The Swan Hills are foothills of the Rocky Mountains, the only foothills that extend into the center of Alberta. As I rounded the last bend, a gravel parking lot opened into my view with room to turn around. A high chain link fence was surrounding the compound. It was completely inaccessible. The huge, heavy chain link gates were double padlocked. This was all I would see of the treatment facility. I thought back to the name Swan Hills and I remembered the aggressive swans from my childhood. I wondered aloud, not that anyone could hear me, has this place been named Swan Hills to suggest a place of tranquility? Or was the name selected as they need an aggressive protector? I had no idea where the name originated, that it was first given to the area by the local indigenous people who believed that giant swans nested on the estuary of the Assiniboine River. During the summer prairie thunderstorms, it was said the thundering wingbeat of these great birds filled the air as they fled for shelter. Swans will fight to the bitter end. I decided the name fulfilled both purposes, the image of tranquility and protection. Even though I didn't get to see the center, my first thought was so logical, it did not require a scientist nor an engineer. No matter what was done to treat the waste, any residue disposed of on the mountaintop had to run downhill. Who were the brains behind such an endeavor? Any communities at a lower level, at a lower elevation, had to experience the terrible consequences of this runoff. Indeed, the plant was hit with a $625,000 fine for leaking toxic PCBs, dioxins, and furans into the atmosphere in 1996. This was the province's largest fine ever issued for environmental violations at the time. And 3 years after my visit to the center, a report would claim that the plant's landfill had begun to threaten groundwater. I thought that was a no-brainer at the time, but it took them a while. The plant would continue to cost taxpayers tens of millions of dollars in operating losses over the years. And many, if not all of the affected communities downstream of Swan Hills are still waiting for improved water treatment plants. Then Premier of Alberta, Ralph Klein, expected the plant to be profitable and was willing to take responsibility for the financial failure. But the Calgary Herald quotes him saying, "I will stand behind the statement that this was not an absolute, total boondoggle." I'm going to finish here with a statement made by the chief, John Mashiskanek, chief of the Yellow Quill First Nation, which was the first First Nation we were able to help and provide safe drinking water for. The chief asked to be quoted with this statement. "Dr. Hans Peterson was an ally to the nation. Our message to other First Nation leaders is to search for these allies, not just consultants, but experts who care because they will go the distance for your people. Our message to Canadians is to be those allies, because if First Nation communities thrive, Canada will thrive." So that's my readings that I chose for you today. There's a lot more information in the book, many, many more stories. I could go on talking all night, but we don't have all night. So I think Zilla and I are now going to talk and I'll answer some of Zilla's questions. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Susan. So as you can see, there's a lot covered in the book, a lot of different experiences in different communities. And we're gonna have a little bit of a chat about that. So first of all, I just wanted to ask you, Susan, what inspired the writing of this book and what does the title mean? Water Confidential.
The title, Water Confidential, really is just depicting a lot of exposés of what I think the majority of Canadians don't know, and I like to think they should know. And I started writing the book. I knew about all of this for the 10 years that I was living on Vancouver Island. I'd never told anybody in my new life about my past and what I'd done. But then I saw a commercial on television about the federal government announcing Bill C-61. And I was so damn mad, I started writing. I felt that people needed to know all these stories. And as far as I'm concerned, with Bill C-61, it's being passed off as if Indigenous people are being given responsibility for their water. And don't get me wrong, I think that's the very best thing that could happen. That's what needs to happen. They need to have responsible for their own affairs. However, when it comes to water, I feel they are being given liability and not responsibility. With the present political system and the deplorable infrastructure that they have in almost all reserves, they do not have a hope of providing truly safe drinking water.
Do you want to tell those who don't know what Bill C-61 is?
It's
called the First Nations Clean Water Act.
Yes. It basically is offering First Nations to apply for relief, excuse me, to be,
There's water.
yeah, thank you. Excuse me. They're offering First Nations that they will be given financial payments if they suffered a boil water advisory. The if is if they suffered a boil water advisory for more than 1 year. Now, the majority of First Nations suffer boil water advisories for 6 months at a time, often for 10, 12, 15, 20 years, but they don't suffer them for more than 1 year at a time. So that disqualifies them. The second part of their requirement is that they can prove that their medical ailments were caused by unsafe drinking water. I would make a bet that they will not be able to find doctors to do that. And I can tell you more about that when we talk about water.
Yeah. So water is part of the land, this beautiful life-giving substance that we see right here. It's part of our natural environment. So how do you see your relationship to the water and to the land as a white settler?
Well, as white settlers, we look on water as a commodity, something to buy and sell. First Nations people, Indigenous people look on water as life. It's a living thing. It's constantly alive, constantly changing, constantly evolving. They have a very different appreciation for water. Water is considered feminine spirit. It's part of giving birth. A fetus grows in the water of a mother's body. It's a very, very totally different approach.
And now you mentioned a little bit earlier about boil water advisory. I know in your book you talk about the use of terminology where there's sometimes boil water advisory, sometimes a drinking water advisory. So how do you feel about the use of those terms?
So I'm going to ask you, if you drive into a community, you're on a road trip, and you go into a hotel, you check in, and they tell you there's a drinking water advisory, what do you think it means? Do you like to make some ideas, some suggestions? Just don't drink the water? Okay, any other ideas?
Don't bathe in it, don't do anything.
Drink
Okay.
more water?
And what do you drink?
Water, which you have to purchase.
Okay. Drinking water advisory is simply the government downplaying boil water advisory. It's exactly the same. You're supposed to boil every drop of water for at least 3 minutes, even to brush your teeth, even to bathe a baby. You're not supposed to let the baby get any water in their mouth, in their nose, in their ears. It's just the same as a boil water advisory, but they've used the term drinking water advisory to play down the seriousness of it. It's no different. But if you go into a community where you're told it's a boil water advisory, do you think you might have a different feeling about the water? To me, a drinking water advisory is somebody telling you you should drink 8 glasses of water a day.
Drink more water, that's how I would read it too.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. So I also note that, kind of on that note, that you talk about regulations for water quality versus guidelines. So what do we have in Canada that people may not know about?
Do you know we're the only country in the developed world that does not have any drinking water regulations? All we have are guidelines. And whilst the First Nations fall under federal government, all of our white settler communities fall under provincial governments. And they can be different in every province. but Indian and Northern Affairs is who I refer to, the government department that's now called Indigenous Services Canada. They have decided that they would make their own protocol for what these guidelines should be. And they've left the bar way down here. The World Health Organization has already set the parameters for what has been deemed the rights of Indigenous people. It's been declared the rights of Indigenous people at the UN. They have set the bar of standards way up here. What right does INAC have to set those bars so low and try to convince Canadians that everything is well?
I read somewhere in your book that you had mentioned that in one community, all they test for is E. coli. So if the water passes a guideline, it doesn't have E. coli, but there's many other things water can have besides E. coli, right?
Yeah, one of the things that Hans used to tell everybody whenever he presented at any kind of workshop was that it is impossible to test for safe drinking water. You can test today for E. coli or whatever else you might choose out of the parameters that you can test for. What you test for today might not be there, it might be negative, but it might well arrive tomorrow because water is evolving, it's changing. The only way you can really guarantee that you have truly safe drinking water is to build a system that will ensure that none of those things get through the filtration system. And every system should be built to the standards set by the World Health Organization. INAC does not have the same expertise as the World Health Organization. They might think they do, but they don't.
And you had mentioned something when we were chatting earlier today about waterborne diseases in Canada. I think you had something that might shock some of the people here about that.
Enteric diseases are basically the stomach flu when you've got to stay home next to the biffy. So often caused by various waterborne ailments. How many enteric diseases do you think are reported by doctors in Canada each year? I'd like you to throw out some numbers.
Who thinks 100 a year? More?
10.
10 a year? Okay. Anyone think 50? None? Zero?
None?
Anyone think more than 100?
More than that.
How much more?
I don't know, I was thinking of a nurse, so I'm like, well, when they get kids in with stool issues.
Yeah.
like that,
Yeah.
They would be looking for that, I'm not sure about reporting it, not sure what happened with that.
Okay, the
They
answer.
won't give the antibiotics.
How about you?
Yeah.
Kristen?
Any more guesses? The answer is 20.5 million. 1 in 2 Canadians report an enteric disease every year. That's not coming from the urban centres, the large urban centres. So you know how rural and Indigenous people are suffering. 1 in 2. Now, think about this a little further. If you have a stomach flu, what's the first thing you say? What did you eat?
Yeah.
Right? Has anybody ever said, what did you drink? You can do a little test. If you're lucky enough to have a family doctor, next time you're in to see the family doctor, play a game with them. Tell them you've got stomach upsets. Tell them you're worried about having some problems. You'd like to be tested to see if you've got anything going on. I would lay bets what your family doctor will say. Their question will be, have you been out of the country? Now, how are these First Nations people going to get doctors to say that their First Nation, that their drinking water has caused their medical ailments? Now, out of that 20.5 million, they estimate that 400,000 are caused by water. That includes swimming in lakes that are polluted. It can be anything, you can pick it up in many ways. But if they estimate 400,000 and your doctor's response is it must have been something you ate, I would like to guess that it's probably more. Probably a heck of a lot more. So that's the state of enteric disease.
Scary. And speaking of scary, your book mentions Walkerton, Ontario, that I'm sure a lot of people remember hearing about that. So that was the small town in Ontario that in 2000, they had an outbreak of E. coli that came from a contaminated water supply, and over 2,000 people got very ill, and 7 died, including a 2-year-old child. And then there was the big inquiry into what happened. So have things changed since Walkerton, and if so, for better or for worse?
Well, I would have liked to include more about Walkerton in my book. A very good friend back then was Bruce Davidson, who founded Concerned Citizens of Walkerton. I was unable to connect with him in the short period I was working on getting this published, but he did call me 2 days before the release date of the book. And for the last 20 years, the people of Walkerton have banded together and made freedom of information requests, one after the other after the other. So Walkerton happened, but the issue really exploded in May of 2000. When do you think the first citizen of Walkerton was reported by a doctor to have E. coli poisoning? Make a guess for me.
10 years after.
No, it was reported in May of 2000 when everybody got sick. So when do you think the first one was reported? It would be prior to May of 2000. When do you think that was first reported by a medical doctor?
Fall of 1999.
Any more ideas? 1978,
So 22 years before
22 years
the
prior.
outbreak.
And on top of it being 22 years prior, for that 22 years, if not every week, at least every month, a citizen of Walkerton was treated for E. coli poisoning by their doctor for 22 years. And what did those doctors say? It must have been something you
Raw
ate.
chicken, poultry, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But there was a cover up. I mean, that's what, when everything started coming out, there was a cover up.
Well, the cover up went beyond the Coble brothers that were charged criminally. The cover up went way further because I'm not sure of the exact date when people were compensated for in Walkerton, but let's say it was March 1st of 2000, that anybody who got sick between March 1st and May, when everybody found out what the real problem was compensated. There was one citizen of Walkerton who was in hospital for most of February, but he was discharged on the last day of February. He did not qualify because his doctor insisted it was something he ate. So this isn't just about water treatment operators and government regulations, it's also about educating our medical people.
And that's interesting because I was also noticing in the book, so there's issues in rural communities like Walkerton and issues on First Nations. But on First Nations specifically, you had talked about some of the engineering contracts to build water systems and some of the problems with those. So can you perhaps share another shocking revelation in this book that I found really disturbing?
Yeah, well, engineers are building infrastructure, improving water treatment plants, and they're getting paid very, very well. I mentioned in the book that I refer to them as white affluent males because I never met a colored engineer, I never met a female engineer, and I never met a poor engineer. And they were all doing very well out of this. And very often, 5 years after they built a plant, they get called back to build, to renovate, to make modifications. It wasn't working. It wasn't meeting INEX guidelines that are way down here. So they're called back. So they make 5 million the first time around, and they go back 5 years later and they make another 2 or 3 million. But don't be harsh on the engineers, because it's INAC giving them these contracts with absolutely zero measurables, zero deliverables, nothing is measured. The engineers go in, they build the plant, they get paid, they get their check, and they bugger off, as most people say. Can you really blame the engineers? It's easy money, when lots of people would do the same thing.
Well, I think you had mentioned in some cases that they were deliberately doing shoddy work the first time to get more money the second time. So to me, that's
There are,
criminal.
I'm quoting in the book, and I'm sorry I can't remember their names, but there are scientists who claim that and took them to task for it, and took INAC to task for it, and INAC responded that they were really quite ashamed of being called out for it, and they never ever denied it.
That's pretty shocking.
Yeah.
Water is confidential. So a little bit of a different issue or element of the book. We've heard a lot of the water issues, the health issues, and the political issues, but there's also a personal aspect to this book. It is a memoir, and it talks a lot about your life with your first husband and your second husband, and raising children, and being part of this organization, traveling, doing all kinds of things, and it was very stressful at times. And it was very isolating. I was really struck by the way you describe your life as a working mother, and you were married with 4 young children at one point, but in your book you mentioned that your husband really wasn't involved in the childcare, didn't see that as his role, so you were essentially left to deal with that alone while he was sometimes gone for months, I think you said it, at times. And you're living in this rural, isolated community. So what was that like for you? How did you survive that?
Well, you know, you live with what you get dealt, right? You carry on. There was not a heck of a lot of options, and you just keep going. But it was also an era when men didn't change diapers. You might have had a good one like you did, but there's a heck of a lot of them that didn't want to bother with that kind of stuff. So it wasn't unusual from an early stage. And then once they were older, and I'm in this predicament, and it's certainly not an easy road, but you can either keep going or you can give up. And I've never been a quitter, so I kept going.
That's amazing. I found that really interesting, just reading how, and you had health challenges along the way as well a few times. Yeah. Your husband had health challenges, so there was a lot going on, and yet you were committed to this safe water project. And I think at one point you mentioned that people were mocking you for it.
Yeah, in our local community of Outlook, Saskatchewan, the people didn't understand what we were doing. The science was foreign to them. We seemed like we come from another planet, and it wasn't unusual. I give one example. I think I give an example in there of going to the school. There's a basketball tournament, and I'm going to take my daughter and some other kids along and what have you. And the phys ed teacher comes out and makes this statement and says, "Well, I guess Mrs. Peterson will have to decide where we stop for coffee to make sure nobody gets sick." In a very mocking tone, sorry. And many of the parents just rolled with laughter. They thought it was hilarious. Bullying comes in many forms.
That's so ridiculous, because they'll be the ones getting sick and the first ones to complain, right? And not appreciate what you're doing. So what was your process like to write this book? How long did it take? Did you plan it out before you started, or was it just spontaneous?
Well, other people have asked me this too. So it was 18 years of living it. It was 10 years of healing from it. And I'd started writing just to write my childhood memoirs, and it had gradually grown. So I was writing the next chapter of my life and the next chapter and so forth. And then when I heard this about Bill C-61, I really zeroed in. And a friend of mine who had been a professor teaching creative writing said to me, "Focus on these 15 years. You've got a book here that needs to get published. Focus on these 15 years. And that's what I did for the next year or so, until I was lucky enough to come across Vicky at Caitlin Publishing, and I can't thank them enough. They've gone out of their way to make this happen.
It's fantastic. So finally, before I open it up for questions, what do you see as the way forward for safe drinking water in Canada?
A few things. I was doing a signing in Kitchener, and a man bought one of my books and left. And he came back 20 or 30 minutes later, and he said, "I sat in the truck and I started reading it, and I couldn't put it down." He says, "So I've come back to buy another one because I want to give another one to my MP." And so when something like that happens, you realize that people are going to spread out. couldn't do anything with the knowledge I knew, but by sharing this and getting it out there and getting enough people to be aware, to be informed, and to start to try and do something. So the more people who can spread the word on social media, within their network of friends, to their MLAs, to their MPs, this isn't going to just be a problem for First Nations, but we do need to have drinking water regulations, and I see it as the first part of true reconciliation, that we are all treated equally, that we all have safe drinking water, which meets WHO.
Thank you, Susan. So now, if there's anybody with questions, and maybe there's some people online with questions as well, this is Q&A time.
Yeah, please speak up.
Is there any online ones?
There's no online questions right now. Our portable mic is being uncooperative. So if you have a question, please lift up your hand and I'll repeat it on the mic so that our viewers at home can hear it as well.
So do the provinces normally set a standard and then INAC is another standard, or how does that like across the country, or is it province by province, or?
Yeah,
I'll just repeat it over the mic, just so people know. It's a question regarding the standards that each province provides, or if it's something that's more widespread and under the umbrella.
There's a piece in the book that explains this a little more. The provinces are only responsible for the white settler communities. They're not responsible for First Nations within their province. The First Nations are under federal jurisdiction and they are governed by the federal Canada, which is Indian Northern Affairs or Indigenous Services Canada. INAC has set guidelines for First Nations. Now Canada has guidelines, but the provinces pick and choose what they want and if they want to adjust or tweak those levels. So the part in the book, and I'm sorry, I can't remember which parameter they're talking about with the standard, but it's explained how the provinces were bickering between themselves as to whether the level should be 80 or 120 or 300. And the province that had the highest level was most concerned about this and insisted on the level remaining really high. That was Saskatchewan. And so other provinces might have a lower level, but the province with the worst problem kept it high for political reasons only because of the cost of bringing that parameter down.
And that's really funny because I know in Canada, certain industries are nationally regulated because they're considered to be necessary to be uniform across the country. So like transportation, like air safety, and I think food safety is federal.
Mm-hmm.
Why is water not when it's so fundamental?
Yeah.
If food is, water surely should be.
Yeah.
And drugs, I think, are federally regulated.
Yeah.
Not the water you take them with.
I did a very interesting Zoom call in Ontario for community gardeners. I would never have thought there was as much interest. Community Gardeners of Ontario had 900 members. There wasn't that many on the Zoom call, but they were concerned because they're all about sustainable food and growing sustainable food and making sure that their food doesn't have E. coli. And here we are with regulation, needing regulations, and we don't have them. So they were super interested in an awful lot of university students. And I guess I'd like to mention here that I'm really humbled when so many of my books are selling. But the most humbling experience for me has been that this book was put forward to the Congress of Humanities. I had no idea what Congress of Humanities is. I've never heard of it before. It's where all the academics from all the universities across Canada pick and choose the new books that are going to be used in curriculum in the universities. So the thought that my book is out there going into universities when I was done school at 15 is pretty darn humbling. It's pretty awesome.
I think I saw a question over here. Yes?
I'm just wondering, do you know if the provincial guidelines are mostly or all about the INAC standard and closer to the WHO?
I'll just repeat the question again. We're asking if the
Provincial guidelines are higher than.
right, the provincial guidelines are higher than the INAC guidelines.
I can't speak for today, but at the time that I was more involved, they were more likely to be lower. I can't tell you what's happened to that
And when we're saying lower, we mean a lower quality or lower levels,
lower levels.
which is good.
And
Yeah.
there were times when, no, that they required lower levels. This is not good.
Oh, okay, that's what I mean, like, cause
Sorry.
high could mean high
Yeah.
amounts, or it could mean,
No, yeah, sorry.
yeah,
So to clarify, if INAC has set their guidelines here, provinces could pick and choose. Some of the parameters might be the same as INAC. There might be some that were higher, but at the time I was involved, they were more likely to be lower, requiring a lower level.
yes,
I have friends that moved about 35 years ago from Winnipeg to Nanaimo. And they were telling me about some friends of theirs who lived, I'm not sure, it was nearby, and there was some type of paper mill or logging mill or something, and there was a runoff, and a lot of them were starting to get sick, but it's the same old story. Nobody wanted to take responsibility vis-a-vis government, because if they're looking into it, they're, you know, it'll end up on your shoulders. And so that's a story that, you know, it's old.
Right, so we're talking about another instance of a water problem in Nanaimo, friends of yours who experienced this, where there was a paper or a logging mill that contaminated the water, people were getting sick, and then no responsibility was taken on the government side.
I think you've got a First Nations really close to Winnipeg that's going through something like that. I might be wrong, but I kind of think it's Grassy Narrows. And I think their
that was
problem,
Mercury, I think.
Mercury, but I think it's from a pulp and paper mill.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to mention here that we have these oil fields in Alberta, and the tailings ponds from the oil fields are built to leak. It's the only effective way they can keep filling them. They're built to leak, and we have diamond mines in Northern Ontario, we have pulp mills across the country, and they are all doing exactly what the government endorses them to do. Nobody is breaking any laws.
Shocking. And there was a question here.
Thanks very much for this. So much in this book. I just wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about what I thought was a really hopeful thing. When the system that Hans developed was installed in some places, the fact of the water operators getting the training and how that empowered them so much. I wondered if you could speak a bit about that.
Yeah.
Okay. We're just asking when Hans's system was put into place, and there was, you know, perhaps a glimmer of hope there where people were trained in terms of being water operators, and if you could expand a little bit on what you saw there.
Yeah, it was really quite fabulous. It's the sort of thing that kept us going, really. The system that he built was called an IBROM. That's Integrated Biological Reverse Osmosis Membrane System. What that meant was that no chemicals were used. So when this was proved to be effective, and by effective I mean it met WHO standards, the water treatment operators were passionate and keen to learn. They learned through hands-on. They didn't learn through trying to read manuals or listen to scientists talk about things. They learned hands-on, side by side. They were extremely proud of their new knowledge and their ability to run the system and provide water for their communities that was to this level. They were absolutely fabulous. I'd like to mention here that these systems have run for more than 20 years without a hiccup. Very often the same water treatment operators, if not the original water treatment operators, trained the new ones. They're very, very capable, very conscientious people. They did a fabulous job. However, the last time I looked, 3 of the original communities were now on boil water advisories for these systems after they've worked for more than 20 years without a hiccup. And I called the operators and asked them, what the heck is going on? Why now? And the answer is very simply, INAC refused to fund any maintenance of those systems. So they haven't cleaned the distribution lines to each house. There is nothing wrong with what the water treatment operators are doing. They're doing their jobs carefully, meticulously, and with great pride. But it's very easy for some of the white settler society to straight away say, see, we knew they'd screw it up eventually, you know? People like to say things like that. There's nothing wrong with what these people are doing. They're doing a fabulous job. It's Indian and Northern Affairs who do not want to fund certain things. They are always looking to save money. And at the same time, I'd also like to mention that the system was taken over by another company who sold it to another company, and they now get contracts to build the IBRON, except the way I explain it, it's kind of like buying a real Rolex watch in a really good jeweler's store, or being given a contract to buy a Rolex watch, and then going and getting one off the sidewalk that looks like a good replica. Because what these people are building, they're telling them they're IBRONs, but they're not. And they're not for the simple reason that they're saving on the media that goes into the IBRONs. Now, the media is a very, very particular media. It's expanded clay, it comes from Scandinavia. It's being used in treatment plants around the world. But if you look at this media, it looks like a giant cubic meter bag of used coffee grounds. It's really small stuff. Now, if you take one of those little grounds and put it under a microscope, it will look like a golf ball. It's got little divots and little things sticking out of it. And that media is hand-picked depending on what the issues are in that source water that's going to be treated. Because the way the IBRON works is that you have a whole host of different bacteria and viruses, parasites, you name it. Most of them that are really challenging are so darn small, it doesn't matter what filtration system you put on, it will not be able to catch them all. So the way the biological system works is that the bigger bad guys eat the little bad guys, and then the bigger bad guys get caught in the filter. So the membranes are set up with specific media in them because the size of the challenging bacteria or whatever has to be able to breed in the little divots of this little tiny golf ball-like coffee ground. So you can imagine how small it is. It's really, really tiny. What they're doing is buying the larger divots that doesn't work as effectively, but it saves them a heck of a lot of money. And I'd like to mention one thing here, that don't think this is just in Canada, but it really comes down to money and corporations and ethics. So just to throw out here for you right now, the Thames Water Board in London, England, okay, has just been caught out. They had the Oxford-Cambridge boat race, which was, how many years they had it? Probably 100 years. Well, they all got sick last year. They all got E. coli poisoning. Where did it come from? It came from the Thames. Well, then they turned out that the Thames Water Board, which has been continuing to pay out fancy dividends to all their shareholders, hasn't been maintaining their lines. And so they've been pumping raw sewage into the Thames. So now they're going back to all the Brits and saying, you know, you pay £300 a year for your provision of water. We need you to double it. Now you've got to come up and pay £600 because we've got to fix the lines and we've got no money because we've paid it all out in dividends. So you've got to ask yourself about who's really responsible here. And a big part of my book is looking at what changes you can make, you know, what things can you do. So most people are not aware, the Royal Bank is the biggest financier of big oil in the world. Now the CEO of the Royal Bank of Canada, I think is McIsaac, he makes approximately $43 million a year. He makes that because of the success of the bank, because I think it's a conflict of interest when he's making that kind of money because he's using the bank's money to give to big oil to make the dividends to pay everybody. Now, who's responsible? Are corporations responsible for social justice? I don't know. Where do you bang?
That's your second book.
I've got other plans for that one.
Oh,
But I do go into it in more detail in the book.
I think something came in from online.
Yeah, we have, actually the Safe Drinking Water Foundation is watching, and they have a few comments here.
Ooh.
Kingdom Construction Limited has 5 projects that were prepared with peppered with a range of allegations. 3 triggered legal action. They also said this book would also be good to be taught in high school classrooms, and there is a teacher's guide on Caitlin Press's website, just for people's great knowledge. Also, they said in 2020, Canada announced additional funding to increase support for O&M of water treatment plants on reserve. This represented an increase from 80% to 100% based on the O&M funding formula. Does this mean that they fund 100% of what they approve, but they do not approve much of O&M? Do you know about that?
Okay, well, I know who it's come from because it's Nicole Hancock, and I hired Nicole, and I'm super pleased that she's there because she's done a fantastic job as executive director for 16 years at the Safe Drinking Water Foundation. She really knows her stuff. She really knows her numbers. She is meticulous. I unfortunately don't know what she means by O&M.
Okay.
So I'm sorry. I guess that's what happens when you retire and you're not up to date on different acronyms. So
Go to the Safe Water Drinking Foundation website, I guess.
yes, yeah, but Nicole
Yeah.
does a fabulous job, and we do have some really awesome children's programs, youth through high school, and very, very equally adaptable to university. Many of those kits are now available free. They have sponsors. They're available for schools to order them. And we were the first organization to translate all of our school programs into Cree because they were mostly used on the prairies where Cree was the most common Indigenous language. And the programs were endorsed by Green Street, which is probably the ultimate in endorsements for school science programs, and they're still being distributed far and wide across Canada. So if you know anybody who's got grandchildren in school, encourage the teachers to order them and teach the kids. They're our future.
That's a really great way, I think, to wrap up. So Susan, I don't know if you had any final thank yous or acknowledgements or anything like that?
Well, thank you to each of you, but huge thank yous to Caitlin Press, because they turned this book around in 8 months and they've gone out of their way. You'll learn when you read this book, I have a few challenges. One of them is that I cannot do cross-referencing accurately. I have trouble with numbers and writing things sometimes. And they stepped up, they did all the citations for me, 163. I knew exactly where they all were. I knew which papers, I had them all ready, but they did all of that cross-referencing. They stepped up and put this book out in 8 months because when they read it, they became as passionate as I was, and I couldn't have done it without them. But also, I want to mention here, and make sure you're all aware, I hope you know how incredibly lucky you are to have McNally Robinson here as a bookstore. I've been in a lot of schools. There isn't anyone that comes close to the caliber of people that you've got here and the services they provide. They have done a fabulous, awesome job. I'm blown away and totally impressed. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Your book to us, and thank you for writing it, and thank you for writing it from the perspective of a woman, a mother, a caregiver, and I'm certain that that adds a lot to this book as well, so it's very admirable and I can't wait to dive into it. I'd like to thank you, I'd like to thank you, Zilla, as well. We'd like to thank Caitlin Press for putting tonight together, and we'll move on to the signing portion of the evening. So this will be happening right here, over on my left. And so we will have Susan signing books. Please feel free to pick one up, get one signed, and don't forget to pay for it. That's all we ask. Thanks everybody for coming on this rainy night and supporting us here.
Thank you. I was remiss. I did want to also say a big thanks to Zilla. She stepped in on this, I think 3 days, 4 days notice. She read the book and got this all together and hosted this for me, and I'm really, really grateful to her. I mean,
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Before you go sign this,
Sideways.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, that's better.
Not with my finger.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lila. Thank you. You bet.
Right over there, I guess.